Greetings, I'm Shad, and welcome to part 4 of the Truth About the FALCHION and MESSER series. In this episode, we'll be talking about the real FALCHION and MESSER. What are these swords, really? And I'll be debunking or discussing misconceptions about their form, function, and design. Now, in episode 2, I mentioned that I felt the FALCHION and MESSER are functionally identical and deserve to be put under the same category, and I proposed the name for that category as blade sword. I do admit that since then, it doesn't appeal to me nearly as much as it once did. And because of that, I'd like to mention the most popular contenders that you, my viewers, have voiced in regards to what you feel the name should be. And that is medieval backsword, single sword, and edge sword. And I do admit, I actually like each one of those better than my own one, blade sword. And so I'm mentioning these names to you, so you can decide what you would like to use in referring to the category that the FALCHION and MESSER are rightly in. And that is the category of single-edged medieval sword. Now, the first kind of misconception that I'd like to debunk is the concept that the FALCHION is actually an Arabian sword. And this does kind of arise in some areas. I certainly know in the Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition and 3.5 edition manuals, the Player's Handbook, the FALCHION is shown as a very Arabian or Middle Eastern looking sword. Well, that is absolutely incorrect. The FALCHION is not a Middle Eastern sword, it is a medieval European sword. Could the FALCHION have been inspired by certain Middle Eastern swords? Well, in discussing this with Mr. Elmsley, he's actually informed me that Islamic swords of the 13th century were actually straight-bladed and double-edged. The oldest known curved Islamic swords appear in the 1290s, a full half-century after the Type 1 FALCHIONs appear in Europe. So we can safely say that the FALCHION is certainly not a Middle Eastern sword, even though it does share some similarities with swords from that region. The next prevalent misconception about the FALCHION is its weight. It has often been said that the FALCHION is a very top-heavy sword, and it is just this crude butchery meat cleaver, and they say, sometimes even in a positive sense, that it's powerful, you'll just hack people to death with it. Well, the surviving FALCHIONs that we have in museums and whatnot don't actually reflect this. They tell a much different story. When James has inspected these swords, he has found them to be much thinner and much lighter than most people suppose. Now, I can understand why this idea has come about, because when you look at a FALCHION, you often are only seeing it from a bird's eye view, seeing it flat in front of you, so you can't really get an idea of the depth. And so what we would naturally do is ascribe the common depth that we would normally associate with regular swords. And when we multiply that depth by the excessive width on certain types of FALCHIONs, specifically Type 1 FALCHIONs, we of course logically come to the conclusion that it must be a very top-heavy sword. And this is when people make the comparison between the FALCHION and the machete, because the machete is a sword that actually accurately reflects what the common idea of what the FALCHION is, even though it's not really that common idea. But when people think of a FALCHION, they think it's a heavy cleaver. Well, that's actually a machete, it's not a FALCHIon. Machetes are meant to be top-heavy, and the concept that it's the kind of the combination between an axe and a sword or a big knife, well, that does kind of ring true for the machete, because it's meant to chop aside brush and branches and small trees and things like that. It is specifically a cleaver. Well, the FALCHION is not a machete. It's not meant to cut brush and branches and other things like that. It's meant to cut people, and also the clothing and cloth armour that they're wearing. James has found that a common thickness for the Conyers FALCHION is about 1.2 millimeters at the spine. Just think about that for a second. 1.2 millimeters at the spine. On a regular sword, and it can vary of course, but the thickness at the hilt can be between 4 to 6 millimeters, and then when you get to just before it curves down to the tip, that can be around between 1 and 2 meters depending on the level of distal taper. Sometimes it can still be up to 4 millimeters. Did I say meters then when I said 1 to 2 at this thing? I meant millimeters, alright? Which is a meter that has been milled down, I think. Millimeter. So let's get that in our heads. The Type 1 FALCHIONs, especially the Type 1A FALCHIONs, Clooney, Conyers FALCHION, very, very thin. And to emphasize it again, let's have a look at these museum examples and look at the deterioration. Look at the edge, alright? How much of the edge has just been chipped or just flaked away as it is rusted? Why? Because the sword was so thin, and in some cases, there are even parts on these blades that has rusted right through the middle because the middle of it is just so thin. It is very significant, very telling on how thin a sword is when the center of that blade starts to rust away and flake away before the edge does. So in comparison to standard weights of arming swords, falchions actually come in generally lighter with some variants. The Conyers falchion can be on the kind of heavy end of the spectrum, weighing in at about 1.3 kilos, but the smaller Cluny falchion comes in at about 850 grams. And when all the falchions of this period have been looked at and weighed, we find that the average weight is around 1 kilo. And in terms of weight, that is actually a little less than the contemporary medieval double-edged swords. When we look at the cross-section of Type 1 falchions, and I am kind of referring to Type 1A falchions, which are the Conyers and Cluny falchions, we can infer quite a bit about how these swords would perform. Now, for one, they would have a very gradual bevel, kind of going down in a V, with a secondary bevel to make it that the edge wouldn't be too thin and fragile. And that's important because considering how thin the sword is already, especially at the spine, you couldn't have no secondary bevel because it would be so incredibly thin on the edge that it would be just too fragile. But that's not to say that the secondary bevel wouldn't be very low already, because the falchion as a whole is already so thin, and that would make its sharpness potential incredible. So you will find a secondary bevel on falchions, but it is very small and fine because the falchion is already so very thin. And this is what I mean when I said that the falchion has more in common with a surgical razor blade than it does with an axe. For one, if you wanted to have a sword that had the qualities of an axe, you would just use an axe, alright? I mean, it does the job that an axe does better than a swordy axe would. Instead, they wanted a sword that was so incredibly sharp. Now, why would they want one that is so incredibly sharp? For cloth armor specifically, it would be amazing how effectively these type of falchions would be able to slash through gambesons and the like. They're so much sophisticated in this type of design. Look at the part in the blade that has been widened. It is right at the point of percussion, and that's the area on the sword where you would most want to strike. And so by widening that area, you're actually lowering the angle of the edge, both on the first bevel and therefore the secondary bevel as well. This would increase the sharpness potential of the sword incredibly, but it's also being very efficient with the use of material, because it's not widening the whole sword, and that would, could you imagine how wide a falchion would be if it was as wide as point all the way down to the hilt? It would make it more cumbersome, more difficult to wield. So no, they've been efficient with the design and only widened that part on the blade that you would most often want to strike with. It is a very clever design. And by being so thin, it also means that the falchion doesn't have to push aside the material to a greater degree than if it was thinner. This makes its ability to kind of slide in through cloth and flesh so much greater. And you can visualize this. Imagine if it was thicker and it's trying to go into any material. That material is a solid piece of cell structure, and so it's trying to force that material apart that is connected. So therefore that creates resistance, it creates friction, and that makes a less effective cut. But if it is thinner, therefore there's less to push aside and it will go down deeper. So the concept that these types of falchions are these heavy, powerful meat cleavers is utterly and completely incorrect. No, they're not. They are these incredibly fast and whippy, slashy cutters that will just slash cloth and flesh to ribbons. What needs to be understood, of course, is that by having such a thin edge would mean that the falchion, or this type of falchion specifically, will be quite fragile against hard materials, especially metal armor. This weapon is the gambeson counter. It will just wreck that stuff, but as soon as you come up to metal armor, not so much. And it makes sense then that this design of falchion started to die out from around 1300 to 1340, because as you go along through the medieval period, you find more cases of metal armor being used by lower classes of soldiers. So it makes sense then that the falchion design started to evolve. The widened part on Type 1 falchions kind of got phased out, and you will also find the edges were not as thin. They shifted to being a bit more robust to handle or to be more durable on the edge. The clipped points also started to get more acute, to get right in between the gaps in mail and armour and such. And in regards to the cross-section of these types of blades, and when I'm saying I'm referring to the medieval single-edged sword, both falchion and messers now, cross-sections can vary quite a bit. Sometimes there was no secondary bevel, sometimes there was. That would largely be determined by where that kind of edge started to go down. If it would create an edge that was too thin and fragile, that's when a secondary bevel would be put on. But if the spine was thick enough that the angle was at about the right point, well then you wouldn't need a secondary bevel and it would just be in a V. Sometimes the bevel would start further down from the spine of the blade, sometimes it would start very close to it. They would have broad, kind of shallow fullers or thin, deep fullers, again depending on the depth that the sword had. Next, I want to talk about the nagel or nail that is commonly associated with the messer. And what it is, it's kind of like a third small crowing that pokes out on the side of the sword. First of all, that is not a defining feature of a messer. Okay, there are many historical examples of messers with no nagel on them at all. And there were many swords that weren't messers, and this can be double-edged, single-edged, falchions, whatever, that had nagels as well. So again, not a distinct identifying feature of messers, common, and they have come to be associated strongly with the messer as well. It is just not essential, which is exactly the same as a side ring on a falchion. It's not an essential identifying feature. Yes, it can be on a falchion, or it can be not on a falchion, and even if it doesn't have a side ring, if everything else ticks the boxes, single-edged, most often, if it's single-edged and it has the handle construction of a sword, it's a falchion, regardless of side ring or not. All the praise that everyone has ever said about the messer, and indeed I've said that too, I've extolled the virtues of the messer because it is an amazing sword with all of its types, especially like the Kriegsmesser. What a beast, okay? All the positive points that we ascribe to the designs of these swords needs to rightly be ascribed to the falchion of the same blade profiles as well. And we need to understand that, again, the falchion has basically an identical form of the messers that we have said are so awesome. And this comes into the next kind of possible misconception that people talk about. And that is this, is that people have said or regarded the Kriegsmesser or messer to be the European equivalent of the katana. Well, first of all, we would again need to extend that to just make the right comparisons, that the messer and falchion, okay, are they the European equivalent to the katana? Well, first of all, it depends in what way are we making the comparison. Socially, no. They didn't hold the same social position in each culture. Functionally, they did serve it both as the sidearm and not primary weapon. So there's that comparison. But what this comparison is really talking about is in effectiveness, okay? We're talking about cutting power, and it is talking about the similarities in blade profile between the falchion and messer, single-edged, slightly curved, and the katana. So in that sense, is the falchion and messer the European equivalent to the Japanese katana? Well, let's look at the similarities. They are both single-edged. The katana generally always has a very shallow curve, and I mean shallow curve, it's not excessive. And falchions and messers, well, they can have shallow curves, and it is generally commonly ascribed to have a shallow curve on the blade profiles that generally have them, but they can also be straight. Alright? And in terms of a general analysis, the similarities kind of stop there. The handles are different, the hilt constructions are different, the crossguards are different, and pummels, or the katana doesn't even have a pummel, which also affects the point of balance. Messers have a wider tang and sometimes a longer tang than a katana. The katana can have a half tang or a full tang, it kind of goes the full length, but because on a messer it's as wide as the handle and they always go down to the very bottom, Then they also have an end cap or a pummel, and in regards to the falchion, though the tang is small, they always have a falchion, the point of balance will be lower on both generally, on both falchions and messers than on a katana. That will affect cutting capacity, but it also affects point control. Now let's look at cutting capacity. Well, that one it can be tricky because there's a lot of factors that will affect cutting capacity. The katana will generally be a little bit more top heavy than the falchion and messer. You need to understand though, the falchion and messer, depending on distal taper, profile taper, angle of the edge bevel, and weight of the pummel, the point of balance on falchions and messers can vary quite significantly, and you can easily get a falchion and messer that are as top heavy as a katana. The next thing that affects cutting capacity to a very large degree is the cross-sectional geometry of the blade. Does it have a secondary bevel? Does it only have one bevel? Where does that bevel begin? How wide is it? How easily can it slide into the material that you're cutting? All these things very much affect the cutting capacity. Now, in my opinion, the cross-sectional geometry of these falchions and messers that are being compared to the katana vary too much to draw a general conclusion on how effective they would be based on the edge, cross-sectional geometry. You can have cross-sections that are nearly identical to the cross-sections of the katana. Generally, they will be wider, than the katana, so looking at width. But apart from that, the cross-sections can be very, very comparable. On the other end, they can be completely different with very wide, shallow fullers with a small kind of edge bevel on the end. They can have multiple fullers as well, and there is generally not such a strict design that the messer and falchion blade profiles need to conform to than what we find on Japanese katanas. So in the end, is it fair to say that the falchion and messer are the European equivalent of the katana? Yes and no, If the cross-section geometry and other things are so close to what a traditional katana would be, then you could make the argument that it is comparable in that sense, and it is just effective in cutting. But generally, no. If you were to take all falchions and all messers, no, you can't really make that comparison because there's too much variance that changes it to make it can be far different than the katana. So here's another question for you then. Is the katana the Japanese equivalent of the European messer and falchion? Anyway, in regards to the comparison, I've already mentioned that I feel that there are superior design elements on both falchion and messers because there's more freedom. You have a longer crossguard, you have more ability to adjust the point of balance, and more freedom to have different blade profiles as well. All there that can, in my opinion, actually make a potentially superior sword than what the katana is. Now that is bashing on the katana a bit. I go into detail as to why that I say that because I feel it's fair to say, but I talk about that in my katana series. Please go watch it if you'd like to hear my thought process on that. And I will say, and this is completely my opinion, I don't know what James's opinion is on this, but my opinion on having very, very slight curves on swords they're pointless. I don't think they actually add to the cutting capacity on swords at all. I still hold that opinion. Many people have offered, arguments, some very compelling arguments, some not so much. But after having listened to those arguments, I feel a lot of the things that they're saying are actually applying to swords that have a greater curve. When we're looking at these very, very small gradual curves, the standard curve that we find on a traditional katana, and the many slight curves we see on falchion and messer blades, they are nowhere near significant enough to actually add any benefit to cutting capacity. And if it made the slightest point, but it's so small, it's not worth even mentioning. And because it offsets the tip from the point of thrust, I feel that slight curves like that are more detrimental than beneficial to swords. And I feel that's the same for falchions and messers as I do with katanas. If the curve is greater, much, much more curvy, well then I agree, there is more benefit to the curve, but you're then losing the ability to thrust more effectively, so it's a balance. And now we have come to the end of this episode, which has been, what is the real falchion and messer? Thank you very much for watching. We are not done. We still have one episode left, the Elmsley typology. Are you excited? I am. I hope to see you there, and until then, farewell. If you would like to support Shadowversity or express appreciation for a video that you particularly enjoyed, please become a patron through Patreon. Your $1 donation would be absolutely wonderful.